Welcome to today's episode of Coffee with Cornelius. Today we are talking about the Orthodox Conservatives, a group that was started in 2020 in the United Kingdom, a group that is composed of Orthodox Conservatives. What are those exactly? We're about to find out. We're going to be talking with Ojel Rodriguez Burgos, head of philosophy and ideology for the Orthodox Conservatives. He is currently a graduate student in political theory at University College London. He's about to start his PhD actually at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and he holds a master's degree from King's College London. As a writer, he has been published in Forbes, The Hill, The Washington Examiner, and The Globe Post. Ojel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in your program.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you first a little bit about your journey. The Orthodox Conservatives, it's relatively new. I think it was started in 2020, just this year, in fact. What led you towards conservatism and joining the Orthodox Conservatives? Just you personally.
Yeah, well, I was born in a rural town called Orocovis in Puerto Rico, which is in the Caribbean. It was a very deeply Catholic family, but I wasn't very practicing Catholic. When I reached my time in university, I was fairly libertarian until I returned to the Catholic Church by my third year in my bachelor's degree. And that return to the Catholic Church and immersing myself, for example, in the Catechism, the part 3, the life in Christ, has been very influential to me. Really drove me into changing my views about libertarianism. And another influential thing was the book, The Conservative Mind, which is written in St. Andrews by Russell Kirk, which is called The Conservative Route, his PhD thesis. That was very influential. So those two things, I really think, returning to the Catholic Church, getting myself to know the teachings of the Catholic Church, and just delving into the ideas of Russell Kirk opened this whole experience to me to conservatism as a whole, as a political philosophy.
Talking about how you returned to the Catholic Church, was that an intellectual return initially, or was that more of a spiritual thing?
It was a personal and a spiritual thing. It was times when I was talking with my parish priest that actually led me to intellectually read the doctrines of the church, the catechism, the social teachings of the church, and that's what primarily, made me, have the conservative view I have. I'm deeply influenced by that reading of Catholic social teaching and the Catholic faith. And like I said, Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind just opened up this whole area of intellectual history of political thought that I hadn't read. So it began like that, actually.
Now, that's interesting to me because somebody who becomes a Catholic may not necessarily drift towards conservatism, right? I know a lot of Jesuits, for example, who are very much in favor of things like social justice, and you might say that they're almost socialist in some ways. I mean, of course, you can't be socialist as a Catholic, but they're very left on the political spectrum. So I find that interesting. Is that something you'd like to comment on a little bit?
Yeah, it's a very interesting, I think, because if you look at most prominent philosophical conservatives right now, they are Catholic. You have Patrick Deneen, even Russell Kirk, before he died, he converted to Catholicism. I think it's
Robert P. George in Princeton.
And Princeton, of course. But I think there's a misreading, I think, of Catholic social teaching, that many people seem to favor social well-being, which is an element of the common good within the Catechism, and they seem to prioritize it too much instead of prioritizing things like social order or rights. So you have to have a balance between those three elements. And I think those people that hold, to a certain extent, socialist or left-wing views, which are Catholic, they're primarily putting well-being far ahead of the other elements of the common good. Or
so let's turn to this issue of conservatism itself. When we think of conservatives, right, we don't really know what to think actually now in the West, because conservatism means so many different things to so many different people. I mean, if you're an American conservative now, and you are a follower of the type of Tucker Carlson type of conservatism, then I mean, you're essentially espousing views that maybe a decade ago would have been left-wing views. But when we think of conservatism, we might think of free markets, low taxes, property rights, and we might also think of things like neoconservatism, a jingoistic foreign policy, you know, invading all of these countries, and perhaps views in favor of preserving family and religion. But the Orthodox conservatives have a very specific view of conservatism. What does it mean to them?
Well, I think we have to differentiate between two things: what is called the conservative movement in the Anglosphere world and conservative philosophy. Let me address the first one.
Okay.
The conservative movement probably is in the 70s, particularly in the United States, that people were calling for fusionism. And the conservative movement came this alliance between free market conservatives, social conservatives, anti-communist, libertarians. And it had this heyday in the 80s, you know, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, had Reagan, to a certain extent, Mulroney in Canada. So they have their heyday. That then came, you know, the market crash, and then came Trump, Brexit, and it rose up. The conservative movement now has deep philosophical clashes. People are arguing for more free market principles. So this is an important conflict, and the conservative movement, I think, has, as we know it in the 70s, is now non-existent. So that's why you have Trump. That's why you have Brexit happening. So the conservative movement, as of now, is non-existent, and you have many people now pulling all their ways. In the issue of philosophical conservatism, it's difficult to define it actually, because you know, Oakeshott and Scruton and even Kirk define it as not a dogma, but as a disposition. So it's very difficult to define it. But
it's not an ideology; it's a disposition.
To a certain extent, yeah. It's a disposition. But I think that has a problem, because Gerald Cohen argued, and I think correctly, that everybody are conservatives, because people do have a disposition to conserve things. So I think using that definition, it's too broad to really define what is philosophical conservatism. My view, and to a certain extent, the organization's view, ranging political where.
So sorry, could you repeat that? Ranging social institutions and political institutions.
So that a well-ordered society, you have a well-ordered society.
Okay.
So that's John Kakis, for example, argued that instead of a well-ordered society, said the institutions should be arranged for a good life. But I think well-ordered society.
What does that mean? What does a well-ordered society mean?
I would argue is where the common good is achieved or pursued. So the question is, what is the common good? Of course.
Exactly.
And I will define it as the social conditions that allow an individual within community and the community itself to reach fulfillment. It draws upon Catholic social teaching, but it's more qualitative in nature than quantitative. So that is how you reach the common good. That's the common good. Of course, the question is, what are the social conditions? So that's where the elements within the Catechism of the Catholic Church come in, that says there are three elements for the common good. I will say, one, social order; two, you have rights; and three, you have well-being. So you have to have those three in union, so that you can have the common good. Of course, within those three elements, there are supposed to be some priorities. For example, for a conservative, social order would be the priority, and then will come rights, and then will come well-being. So you have to have a principle of priority between those three elements, but those three elements must be present within the institutions that you create in society, so that you may have that well-ordered society. And that is, in my view, what should be philosophical conservatism.
You referred to Roger Scruton, who's somebody I really enjoy reading. He's a fantastic writer. And one of the concepts he has to explain, I think, conservatism and conserving things is oikophilia, right? This love of home, the love of your territory. Is that something that the Orthodox conservatives would also embrace?
Yes, yes. It's I think implicit within the common good, within the idea of social order, that you are not individual atoms like Charles Taylor argued against modern liberal philosophical liberalism. You belong. You have an allegiance. You have an attachment to your home, to your society, to where you come from, because it is an historical collective wisdom that has gotten you to the place you are, where you have your rights, where you have the things that you enjoy now. So yes, the Orthodox conservatives really believe that we should promote our society, our communities, our culture, our tradition, and that's how you have a well-ordered society, where the common good is pursued and achieved.
So I'm going to give you a hypothetical situation, and I'm going to ask you how the Orthodox conservatives would approach the situation. So let's take the issue of indigenous land claims. And, in Canada, for example, we have well-defined laws, we have well-defined treaty obligations to consult with indigenous peoples on land issues when it comes to things like pipelines, for example. So this love of home, right? This pursuit of the well-ordered good and the virtue ethics and so on. How would you approach that? I mean, if an oil company is saying, let's go drilling into these sands which are on native territory. I mean, obviously a libertarian is going to say, it's the free market, just let the free market do whatever it wants. You pay these people some money and then, done. It's all done. How would an Orthodox conservative approach that as compared to a libertarian, for example?
I think it depends on three normative aspects.
All right.
First, the first one is prudence. So Thomas Aquinas argued that that was the most important of the cardinal virtues, prudence. So in order to normatively analyze that, you have to consider if this is a prudent action. Is this limited to the problem or limited to the area? Second, you have to decide the principles of Catholic principles of subsidiarity. That means you would prefer localism, lower order, social institutions managing that. And also the third part is the common good. So I think and I agree with Scruton that conservatives are natural supporters of the environment. I think the conservatives and our organization will oppose that because we value our home, we value our landscape, we value our communities, and not everything is the free market. And this is my my biggest critiques of people that are libertarians or free market conservatives, that they have deified the market to a certain extent. So every question, every moral question can be solved by the market, and I think they're incorrect. And so the Orthodox conservatives would say, no, we value our homes, we value our landscape, we value our communities, and the question is not necessarily economic question. It's a question of the common good, it's a question of prudence, and it's a question of subsidiarity.
So somebody might look at you guys and say, okay, in the past 50 years, we've had a lot of progress in Western society. We've had the advent of things like same-sex marriage. We had increasing globalization, the rise of the internet. How do you respond to someone who says that conservatives like you are just trying to halt progress? How would you respond to people like that?
I think they're making a classical mistake. Let me hark back to philosophy. It has been argued in the academic world, and one of my most important mentors in my bachelor days in Puerto Rico argued this. In order to have a coherent political theory, you have to have three subsets. You have to have a theory of the human condition, a theory of institutions, and a theory of political change.
Okay.
So they have to be coherent. So let me take an extreme example. Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan, book 1, chapter 13, he talks about the state of the human nature. He's very negative about it. So if he is negative about it, he cannot come out with a theory of institutions, a democratic theory of institutions. So he has to be coherent. So conservatism does have a theory of political change. It must have a theory of political change to be a coherent political philosophy. Of course, we believe in reform. We believe, and like I mentioned a moment ago, again, that reform has to be prudent, has to be based on subsidiarity, it has to be based on the common good. And that's why, for example, Anglo-American conservatism, to a certain extent, is the dominant view of conservatism. Because if you look, for example, at European conservatism, within the French Revolution afterwards, maybe Joseph de Maistre and on the Pope and considerations, he really didn't argue for reform. So you have to have that degree of political change to have a successful, coherent political philosophy, and that's why we believe in reform. Yes.
So you believe in change, but subject to certain constraints, right? So what would those constraints be? Yeah.
I repeat, I will say it has to be prudent change. Mm-hmm. It has to be subsidiary change. It has to be common good change.
Right.
So, of course, the two are easy to explain, but the third one, when we talk about the elements, it means that we have to have change that contributes to the social order. It doesn't undermine the social mm-hmm. order, that it protects the rights that have evolved, come out of this process of tried and tested and collective wisdom of society and well-being. So that's how you should view change. Of course, it doesn't mean that all change will suffice, will have all those three things in common. So not all change is good. So, but I would suggest that you should have those three things in your mind to decide whether this change is acceptable or not.
And change can sometimes also be violent and forceful in some ways. It can disrupt people's homes. It can disrupt their territories. I mean, I think of globalization. I think of outsourcing. And even this example I gave you with indigenous land claims and, building an oil sands project through an indigenous land, it upsets people's homes. It upsets their community. It upsets their social capital, right? Their way of life.
Yeah, their way of life.
So I can see where you're going with that, but at the same time, someone would still say a lot of our progress over the past 300, 400 years, the Industrial Revolution, is technological progress, right? Technological progress has really, really helped humankind escape poverty and escape all kinds of vile conditions. Surely you're not against technological progress, right? Surely these people would say, these technophiliacs, I suppose, would say, hey, technological progress is independent of social change. Is that true? Is that something that you would agree with?
Not necessarily. Progress will always occur. The problem is that many people make the mistake that all progress is good. Not all progress is good. So yes, we do accept progress. Conservatives should accept progress, but like I said, it has to be constrained with those ideas, normative ideas that I presented, so that we can maintain that common good society, that well-ordered society that we want. Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of technology too, if you look at it, has led to a sense of loneliness in Western societies. I think you write about this. In fact, I'm not sure, in one of your articles for the Orthodox Conservatives, we've come to live in an autonomous, individualistic society that is unnatural, that is not rooted in any kind of sense of our communities and our traditions. A liberal, and by liberal, I don't mean a liberal in the modern day sense, right? I don't mean somebody who's on the left. I mean somebody who's a classical liberal who believes in these Enlightenment values of natural rights and so on. A classical liberal would come back at you and say, hey, all we're doing is returning man to their natural state, right? All we're doing is saying, each individual person has a will and has a will to do certain things for themselves, and their community and their society and their traditions and even their religion are just holding them back. So how would you respond to that particular challenge to your philosophy?
Well, I think I wouldn't say it's just classical liberalism. I think it's the entirety of modern liberalism. For example, Dworkin egalitarianism and Rawlsian liberalism. I think it comes from this idea from liberalism that, and to a certain extent, comes from Kant's philosophy, that people people should be free, should not be coerced by the state to determine what should be the good life. So, for example, Rawls will say, well, I will have these two principles of justice. I'm going to respect your rights. You decide what is the good life for you. So they prioritize the rights over the good. But I think that is a flawed view. I think if you look at, for example, the communitarian argument, I think it has more validity. And Michael Sandel's in his book, The Spheres of Justice, in the first few pages, talks about this. He says, no, you have to have a common conception of the good life in order to affirm some of the freedoms that you want to affirm, because individuals are not, harkening back to Charles Taylor, individual atoms. We are people that our modern selves, ourselves, are constructed by the community, by our relationships, by our allegiance to traditions, history, and all that. So that is the real debate. That's the debate. The liberals, and when I say liberals, I'm putting there libertarians and Rawlsian liberals, just to say a few, have that view that government should not coerce people to have a good life, a certain common conception of the good life, and us and the communitarian side, conservative side, that no, that if you want to affirm those rights, you have to have a common conception of the good. So that you see that also in a public discourse. For example, modern individualism, it's rampant in our society. People say, I determine what is good for me.
Yeah.
The problem is, if you really look at how people live, people don't live that way. Let's take an example. I want to play baseball. I don't know how to play baseball.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know how to play baseball. Let's say you invite me to play baseball. Okay. Yeah. I can come to the field and swing my bat and do whatever I want. But if I don't constrain myself to a common conception of how to play baseball, I will not be truly free to play baseball.
Yeah.
But the problem is that people, when it comes to the absolute questions, the questions of morality, the questions of values, people say, oh no, I decide what they are. So
interesting. So you're saying to be truly free, you have to be, I don't want to say constrained, but you need to have virtue. You need to have some way of ordering your life that allows you to be free. In other words, freedom is knowing what path to take, not just taking whatever path fancies your whim at that particular moment.
Yeah, because and this, because I consider myself a communitarian, will say that yes, there's a universal conception of the good life. You can have the good life you want, but it has to be constrained between this universal communitarian conception of the good life. And that's how you're really truly free, because that's how rights comes. For example, Michael Sandel argues that rights come from the common good. They're an element of the common good. So if you accept this common conception of the good life, that, for example, it's one for the West, and some for Western countries is different for other countries, other communities, but you have to accept that in order to really truly be free. You have to sometimes you have to have like Isaiah Berlin called for a certain freedom for. You have to have a purpose for your freedom.
Let's take ourselves out of the philosophy for a moment. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you some questions about what an ideal society would look like. And I'll start off with this. Okay, you're from Britain. You guys are based in the UK as an organization, as a think tank, and you're pretty new. Let me ask you some specifics. Would you guys retain the monarchy?
Yes, of course. It's part of the institution.
But as a Catholic, though, don't you find it a little bit uncomfortable, the fact that this is a monarchy that is Protestant, and not only Protestant, but one that which forcefully broke away from the Roman Catholic Church?
It does raises my inner Catholic, my inner papist things in my mind. But if I want to immerse myself in the community of Britain, I have to be a monarchist. If I expect somebody to really integrate to the United States, for example, I would expect him to be a believer in the Republic. So it's part of where you live. In the case of Britain, because it's a constitutional monarchy, we have to defend it because that's part of what has been the history, the collective wisdom of society to maintain that institutions. And like I said, that institutions has some common good value. That's why it's there. So
That's
yes,
interesting.
the monarchy is supported.
That's interesting because it's not what you're talking about is not a typical value. It's not a judgment that, say, an economist would bring to it, right? It's not something that a libertarian would bring. A libertarian would look at the monarchy and say, okay, well, maybe we could retain the monarchy because the tourist money brings in a lot of income for the UK, and hey, it might be a little bit of an expense, but we can traffic the expense, we can hold the expense because the monarchy is good. So okay, you would retain the monarchy. Would you retain, or would you reform the House of Lords to put back in place the hereditary lordship?
This is my personal opinion because we haven't, as an organization, have an opinion on that.
Okay.
Personally, I would return the House of Lords back to its. I think I would be more radical. I would repeal the 1949 1911 Parliament Act. I'm a real believer in bicameral legislatures, and I think the product of legislation that comes now from the Commons, that it's basically just pushed through because any government has a majority in the Commons, has really lowered the bar to a certain extent, and I think Britain would benefit, from bringing back a strong House of Lords, one that is not only a revising chamber, but it also has legal power to stop the excesses of majority
is that because
in the
the
Commons.
House of Lords is traditionally supposed to be a vestige of all of the traditional values and the august institutions that the UK is supposed to embody, and therefore it's supposed to put a stop on, say, the lower house's, I guess, passionate pleas for change? Is that a fair way of characterizing it in terms of your philosophy?
I'm happy that you brought that up because I was reading the French Revolution, about the French Revolution. It's a kind of the three estates within the British Parliament. So you have the Commons, the people, and you have in the House of Lords mainly bishops and the aristocracy. So yes, I think it brings up all the interests of the kingdom within the annals of power, and I think it will benefits the country as a whole because it's more united. You have all the interests of the kingdom within that parliament. But that's, like I said, that's my personal opinion. Of even harkening back to repeal the 49 and 1911 Parliament Act.
Sure. Now, one last thing. In terms of immigration, where would the Orthodox Conservatives stand on that? Just in terms of immigration policy more broadly, immigration can be good. I think that's fair to say. But I think to the extent that you have an overwhelming majority or mass of immigrants, they can really disrupt the underlying institutions and the oikophilia associated with the home, right? According to your philosophy, anyway. Where's the balance? How would you change immigration policy in the UK?
I think the biggest problem is that, and this is this part is personal view, that people don't know what is to be British. So because I don't think people have really defined what is to be British. So it has been very difficult, I think, for the government to establish policies that integrate immigrants. So, and this harkens back to what we were saying about the common conception of the good life. We are not just people in a territory. We are a community. We are people that have a long history. So I think immigration, and this, I think this is the position of the Orthodox Conservatives, is good, but it shouldn't be in the huge numbers that we have seen in the past few years. It has to be prudent. It has to be beneficial to the common good, and it has to integrate people successfully so that we have not a community of individual atoms, but a community of
Yeah.
people that have allegiance, have traditions, and history together. It's
So
not
kind of like
like a moral desert.
right, kind of like the Huguenots, I guess, right, who
Yeah,
came to Britain and very well integrated into the
integrated. Yeah.
society. So, all right, so thank you very much for joining us, Ohel. I really appreciate that, and thanks for laying out the philosophy of the Orthodox Conservatives for us.
Thank you very much. All congratulations on your program, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.